Sarah Martinez had always been different from the other girls in her small Texas town. While they spent their evenings at cheerleading practice or gossiping about boys, she could be found at the local gym, throwing punches at heavy bags until her knuckles were raw. Her father, Miguel, had been a boxing coach before an injury ended his career, and he'd taught his daughter everything he knew about the sweet science of fighting. At 23, Sarah worked as a receptionist at Henderson Construction, the biggest building company in Millbrook. The pay wasn't great, but it was steady work, and she needed every dollar to help support her younger brother's college education. Their mother had passed away when Sarah was 16, leaving her to step up and become the woman of the house while their father worked double shifts to make ends meet. The owner of Henderson Construction was Marcus Henderson, a man who had inherited the business from his father and never let anyone forget it. Marcus was 35, tall, and considered handsome by most people in town. He drove expensive cars, wore designer suits, and lived in the biggest house on Maple Street. But, beneath his polished exterior, Marcus was a bully who used his wealth and position to intimidate anyone he saw as beneath him. From the day Sarah started working at Henderson Construction, Marcus made her life difficult. He would bark orders at her, criticize her work in front of other employees, and make snide comments about her appearance. Sarah came to work dressed professionally, but Marcus would find fault with everything from her hairstyle to her choice of shoes. "Sarah, your desk is a mess again," Marcus would say loudly, ensuring everyone in the office could hear. "How do you expect our clients to take us seriously when the first thing they see is your disorganized workspace?" Sarah would bite her tongue and clean her desk, even though it was perfectly organized. She needed this job, and she couldn't afford to lose her temper with the boss. But, each day, Marcus seemed to push a little harder, testing her limits. The other employees at Henderson Construction were split into two groups. There were the longtime workers who had been with the company since Marcus's father ran things. These men and women remembered when the business was built on respect and hard work, not intimidation. They liked Sarah and admired her patience in dealing with Marcus's behavior. Then, there were Marcus's friends and newer employees who had been hired because they laughed at his jokes and made him feel important. These people enjoyed watching Sarah get humiliated because it made them feel superior. They would snicker when Marcus criticized her and sometimes add their own cruel comments. The breaking point came on a particularly busy Friday in September. Henderson Construction had just landed their biggest contract in years, a shopping center project that would keep the company busy for the next 2 years. Marcus was feeling especially confident and decided to celebrate by having lunch catered for the entire office. As everyone gathered in the break room, Marcus stood up to make a speech. He talked about the company's success, his leadership, and his vision for the future. Then, his eyes landed on Sarah, who was quietly eating her sandwich in the corner. "You know," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the room, "some people in this office really understand what it means to work hard and contribute to our success. It's not very feminine, if you ask me." The room fell silent. Even Marcus's supporters seemed uncomfortable with how far he was taking things. Sarah set down her sandwich and looked directly at her boss. Her hands were trembling, not with fear, but with rage. "Mr. Henderson," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm building inside her. "I have never transferred a client to the wrong department. My work performance has been excellent, and you know it." Marcus's smile widened. He had been hoping for a reaction, and now he was getting one. "Are you calling me a liar, Sarah? Because I can check the phone records if you'd like. I'm sure we'll find some very interesting mistakes." "Check them," Sarah replied, standing up slowly. "Please, check them right now. I'd love to see these mysterious transfers that never happened." The confidence in Marcus's expression flickered for just a moment. He hadn't expected Sarah to call his bluff so directly. But he was in too deep now to back down in front of his employees. "Your attitude is exactly the problem here," Marcus said, his voice getting louder. "You think you're better than everyone else because you can throw a few punches at the gym. But let me tell you something, sweetheart, this is the real world. And, in the real world, muscle doesn't matter if you don't have the brains to back it up." "Sweetheart?" Sarah repeated, her voice dangerously quiet.
Did you just call me sweetheart in front of the entire office?
Marcus realized he had made a mistake, but his pride wouldn't let him apologize.
Instead, he doubled down. I'll call you whatever I want to call you. You work for me, remember? If you don't like it, there's the door. Sarah looked around the room at her coworkers.
Some looked embarrassed, others excited to see what would happen next. The older employees who had known her father were shaking their heads in disapproval at Marcus's behavior.
You're right, Sarah said finally. You can call me whatever you want. But, you know what you can't do? Marcus raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to continue. You can't lie about my work performance. You can't humiliate me in front of my coworkers based on made-up mistakes. And, you definitely can't get away with creating a hostile work environment just because you think your money makes you untouchable. The room was dead silent now. Everyone could feel the tension building like electricity before a thunderstorm.
Marcus's face was turning red with anger and embarrassment.
You're fired,
Marcus said, his voice cold and final.
Clean out your desk and get out of my building. Now. Sarah nodded slowly.
She had expected this outcome, but she wasn't going to leave quietly.
Fine.
I'll clean out my desk. But first, I want everyone in this room to know something about their boss.
You don't get to make speeches, Marcus snapped. Security will escort you out if necessary. What security? Sarah asked with a slight smile. Old Pete who sits at the front desk reading his newspaper? I don't think Pete is going to want to get involved in this.
Marcus stepped closer to Sarah, trying to use his height and presence to intimidate her. It was a move that had worked on countless people before, but Sarah didn't flinch. Listen to me very carefully, Marcus said in a low voice that only Sarah could hear.
You're nothing. You're nobody.
You come from nothing, and you'll never amount to anything. I could have you blacklisted from every decent job in this town with one phone call. Sarah looked up at him, her dark eyes blazing with controlled fury.
Are you threatening me, Mr. Henderson?
I'm promising you, Marcus replied with a nasty smile. Cross me, and I'll make sure you never work in this town again. It was at that moment that something inside Sarah snapped. Not her temper, she was too disciplined for that. But something deeper, a switch that had been slowly building toward the off position for months of abuse and humiliation.
You want to know something about me, Marcus? Sarah said, loud enough for everyone to hear again. Something you might find interesting?
Marcus smirked, thinking he had broken her spirit.
Enlighten us. I've been keeping detailed records of every inappropriate comment you've made to me and every female employee in this office. I have dates, times, witnesses, and some very interesting audio recordings from my phone. Marcus's smile disappeared instantly. You can't record conversations without consent. That's illegal.
Actually, Sarah said calmly, in Texas, only one party needs to consent to recording a conversation. I consented to record myself being harassed at work.
Completely legal.
The color drained from Marcus's face. Around the room, several people were pulling out their phones, some probably recording what was happening right now. You're bluffing, Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out her smartphone. She scrolled through her files and selected one from the previous week. Marcus's voice filled the room clearly. Sarah, honey, you need to wear something a little more flattering tomorrow.
We have important clients coming in, and I need you to look presentable. You know what I mean?
Then, Sarah's voice, professional and polite, Mr. Henderson, I dress according to the company dress code every day. And, Marcus again, the dress code is the minimum.
I'm talking about making an effort. Show a little leg, or something that fits better. Trust me, it'll help your career here. Sarah stopped the recording.
The room was completely silent except for the sound of the air conditioning humming overhead. That's just one of about 30 recordings I have, Sarah said quietly. There are also the comments about my body, the times you've stood too close to me on purpose, the way you talked to Linda in accounting, and the particularly disgusting thing you said about the new intern last month. Marcus was sweating now, realizing that his behavior had been documented far more thoroughly than he'd ever imagined. In today's world, this kind of evidence could destroy a career and a reputation overnight.
What do you want?
Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper.
Nothing from you, Sarah replied.
I'm going to file a complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and I'm going to let them sort this out. Oh, and I'm going to make sure every woman in this town knows exactly what kind of boss you really are. Marcus's mind was racing. His wife, his social standing, his business relationships, everything could be destroyed if these recordings became public. In desperation, he played the only card he thought he had left. You have no idea who you're messing with, Marcus said, his voice getting louder again.
My family has connections in this town. My uncle is the mayor. My cousin works for the district attorney's office. You think you can threaten me and just walk away?
Sarah had been walking toward her desk to gather her belongings, but she stopped and turned around slowly.
Did you just threaten to use your family's political connections to intimidate me?
Marcus realized he had made another huge mistake, but he was too angry and scared to think clearly.
I'm just telling you how things work in the real world.
The real world, Sarah repeated thoughtfully.
You mean the world where rich bullies think they can abuse their employees and then use their family connections to cover it up? That's not what I said. That's exactly what you said. And you know what's really funny about that?
Sarah pulled her phone out again and showed Marcus the screen.
I was still recording.
The blood drained from Marcus's face completely. Threatening to use political connections to silence a harassment victim was potentially criminal, and definitely the kind of scandal that could bring down more than just his business. Sarah, let's talk about this reasonably, Marcus said, his voice completely different now. Gone was the arrogant bully, replaced by a desperate man who was beginning to understand the depth of his problems.
Oh, now you want to be reasonable? Sarah asked. After months of humiliation, after threatening my career, after trying to use your political connections to scare me, now you want to have a reasonable conversation?
Marcus looked around the room at his employees, many of whom were staring at him with a mixture of shock and disgust. His carefully crafted image as a successful, powerful businessman was crumbling before their eyes. Look, maybe I came on a little strong, Marcus said, trying to salvage the situation. But, you have to understand, running a business is stressful.
Sometimes I say things I don't mean. A little strong?
Sarah's voice was rising now, and, for the first time since this confrontation began, her carefully controlled anger was starting to show through. You've been systematically harassing me for 8 months.
You've made my work environment hostile and toxic.
You've made comments about my body, my family background, and my personal life. You've lied about my work performance to humiliate me in front of my colleagues. And, when I stood up for myself, you threatened to destroy my career and use your political connections to silence me. Sarah was walking closer to Marcus now, and, despite being several inches shorter than him, she seemed to be growing taller with every step.
And, you think that's coming on a little strong? Sarah continued. You think that's just stress from running a business?
Marcus took a step backward, suddenly, very aware that the woman approaching him had spent years training in a sport where the goal was to knock people unconscious. Sarah, please, let's just calm down and discuss this like adults, Marcus said, his voice getting higher with panic. I am calm, Sarah replied, and the scary thing was that she really did sound calm. Her voice was steady, her breathing was controlled, and her movements were precise.
I'm calmer than I've been in months, actually. You know why?
Marcus shook his head, not trusting his voice. Because for the first time since I started working here, I'm not walking on eggshells around you. I'm not biting my tongue when you insult me. I'm not pretending to be okay with your behavior just because I need this job. Sarah was now standing directly in front of Marcus, close enough that he could see the determination in her dark eyes. I spent 8 months letting you make me feel small because I was afraid of losing my job, Sarah continued. I let you humiliate me because I thought I had no choice. But, you know what I realized today?
What?
Marcus whispered.
I realized that some things are more important than a paycheck. And my self-respect is one of them. With that, Sarah turned around and walked to her desk to collect her personal belongings.
The entire office watched in complete silence as she gathered her photos, her coffee mug, and the small cactus plant she kept by her computer monitor. Marcus stood frozen where she had left him, still processing what had just happened. In the span of 15 minutes, his entire world had been turned upside down. The recordings Sarah had could destroy his marriage, his business, and his reputation. The threat to use political connections could potentially result in criminal charges. And all of it had happened in front of his employees, who would undoubtedly spread the story throughout the entire town before the day was over. As Sarah packed the last of her belongings into a small cardboard box, Marcus's survival instinct finally kicked in. He had to do something to stop this situation from spiraling completely out of control. "Sarah, wait," Marcus called out as she headed toward the door.
"Please. Can we talk privately?"
Sarah paused and looked back at him. "There's nothing private about what you did to me, so there's nothing private about my response."
"You wanted to humiliate me in front of everyone? Well, congratulations. You just humiliated yourself in front of everyone instead."
Marcus rushed after her as she walked toward the exit.
"Please, I'm begging you. Think about what you're doing. Those recordings, they could destroy everything I've worked for."
Sarah stopped walking and turned to face him one last time. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly across the silent office. "You should have thought about that before you decided to abuse your power. You should have thought about that before you made my life miserable for 8 months. And you definitely should have thought about that before you threatened to use your family's political connections to silence me."
"I'll pay you," Marcus said desperately. "Whatever you want. A settlement, a reference letter, anything. Just please don't file those complaints." Sarah's expression hardened. "You think this is about money? You think you can just write me a check and make 8 months of harassment go away?"
I don't know what else to do," Marcus admitted, his voice cracking with desperation.
"Here's what you can do," Sarah said firmly.
"You can think about your behavior every time you interact with an employee from now on. You can remember this moment every time you're tempted to abuse your power. And you can pray that the women in this town are more forgiving than they have any reason to be." With that, Sarah walked out of Henderson Construction for the last time, carrying her small box of belongings and leaving behind a boss who was just beginning to understand the consequences of his actions. Sarah's hands were steady as she drove home from Henderson Construction, but her mind was racing. 8 months of suppressed anger had finally found an outlet, and the adrenaline was still coursing through her veins. She had done what she thought was impossible. She had stood up to Marcus Henderson and exposed his behavior in front of his entire staff. But, as the initial satisfaction began to fade, reality started to set in. By the time she reached her small apartment on Cedar Street, Sarah's phone had already started buzzing with text messages. Word traveled fast in Millbrook, and several co-workers had reached out to express their support. Linda from accounting had texted, "Girl, I can't believe you finally said what we were all thinking." Marcus had that coming for years. Even some of Marcus's supporters seemed shaken by what they had witnessed. Sarah's apartment reflected her practical nature, furnished with second-hand pieces but kept meticulously clean and organized. The only decorations were family photos and her collection of boxing trophies from her amateur fighting days. She set the cardboard box from work on her kitchen table and stared at it for a long moment. Such a small container for 8 months of her professional life. Her phone rang, and she saw her father's number on the screen. Miguel Martinez worked nights at the oil refinery outside town, but news had apparently reached him even there.
"Nija, what happened?" Miguel's voice was concerned but not accusatory.
He had raised his daughter to stand up for herself, and he trusted her judgment completely. Sarah spent the next 20 minutes telling her father the entire story, from months of harassment to the final confrontation in the break room. Miguel listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of disapproval when she described Marcus's worst behavior. "I'm proud of you," Miguel said when she finished.
"Your mother would be proud too. You did the right thing." "Did I, Papa?"
I might have just destroyed any chance of getting another job in this town.
Marcus has connections everywhere.
Then, we'll figure something else out.
But, you couldn't have kept taking that abuse. It was eating you alive, even if you wouldn't admit it. Miguel was right, and Sarah knew it.
The job at Henderson Construction had been slowly crushing her spirit, making her doubt herself and her worth. She had been becoming someone she didn't recognize, timid, apologetic, constantly second-guessing herself. After hanging up with her father, Sarah spent the evening researching her legal options. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission had clear procedures for filing harassment complaints, and Texas labor law offered some protection for whistleblowers. But she also discovered how difficult these cases could be to win, especially against someone with Marcus's resources and connections.
The next morning brought unexpected developments.
Sarah woke to find several missed calls from reporters at the local newspaper and radio station. Apparently, someone had leaked the story of what happened at Henderson Construction, and the media was suddenly very interested in Marcus Henderson's workplace behavior. The first call she returned was from Janet Morrison, a veteran reporter at the Millbrook Weekly who had covered local business news for over 20 years. Janet had heard the basic story but wanted to interview Sarah for a more detailed account.
"I'll be honest with you, Sarah," Janet said during their phone conversation. "This isn't the first time I've heard complaints about Marcus Henderson. But nobody has ever been willing to go on record before." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked.
"Over the past few years, I've had 3 different women reach out to me about inappropriate behavior at Henderson Construction. But they all backed down when they realized the story would be public. Marcus has a reputation for making life difficult for people who cross him." This information both encouraged and worried Sarah.
On one hand, it confirmed that Marcus's behavior was a pattern, not an isolated incident.
On the other hand, it suggested that he had successfully intimidated previous victims into silence.
"Are these women willing to talk now?" Sarah asked. "I'm reaching out to them."
Your decision to go public might give them the courage they need to tell their stories too. By Monday morning, the story had spread beyond Millbrook. A larger regional newspaper picked up the story, and social media began amplifying Sarah's account of workplace harassment at Henderson Construction. The audio recordings, which Sarah had provided to the EEOC as evidence, somehow found their way to local radio stations. Marcus's voice, clearly identifiable to anyone in town, played repeatedly throughout the day. "Sarah, honey, you need to wear something a little more flattering tomorrow. We have important clients coming in, and I need you to look presentable."
The reaction was swift and severe.
By Tuesday, 3 major clients had canceled contracts with Henderson Construction. The company's bank called to discuss their outstanding loans. And, most damaging of all, Marcus's wife Rebecca moved out of their house and filed for separation.
Sarah watched these developments with mixed emotions.
She had wanted Marcus to face consequences for his behavior, but she hadn't anticipated how quickly and completely his life would unravel. Part of her felt guilty for the collateral damage, the innocent employees who might lose their jobs if Henderson Construction went under, Rebecca Henderson who was humiliated by her husband's public scandal. But her sympathy for Marcus himself was limited. When Janet Morrison's article appeared in Wednesday's paper, it included interviews with 2 other former Henderson Construction employees who detailed similar patterns of harassment. Both women described a workplace culture where inappropriate behavior was tolerated and even encouraged, as long as it came from someone with power. Maria Santos, who had worked as a project coordinator for Henderson Construction 2 years earlier, described how Marcus had made her job impossible after she rejected his advances. "He would assign me to projects that were doomed to fail, then blame me when things went wrong. He made it clear that my career there depended on my willingness to socialize with him outside of work." Jennifer Walsh, a former office manager, told an even more disturbing story. "Marcus cornered me in the supply closet one day and put his hands on me. When I pushed him away, he told me that I could either be friendly or find another job. I quit the next week." These revelations painted a picture of systematic abuse that had been going on for years. Sarah realized that her confrontation with Marcus had given other victims the courage to speak out, creating an avalanche effect that was exposing the true scope of his misconduct.
On Thursday evening, Sarah received an unexpected phone call from Rebecca Henderson. Marcus's soon-to-be ex-wife asked if they could meet for coffee to talk privately. They met at Millie's Diner, a small restaurant on the outskirts of town where they were unlikely to be recognized or overheard. Rebecca looked exhausted and older than her 32 years. Her usually perfect makeup was minimal, and she wore simple jeans and a sweater instead of her typical designer outfits. "I owe you an apology," Rebecca said without preamble once they had ordered their coffee. "I knew Marcus could be difficult, but I had no idea how he was treating you and the other women at work." Sarah studied Rebecca's face, trying to gauge her sincerity. "How could you not know? You were married to him." "Because I didn't want to know," Rebecca admitted. "There were signs, comments he made about female employees, the way he talked about women in general. But I told myself it was just talk. I convinced myself that he was a good man who sometimes said inappropriate things." Rebecca's hands were shaking slightly as she lifted her coffee cup. "When I heard those recordings on the radio, I couldn't deny it anymore. That wasn't my husband having a bad day or being stressed about work. That was my husband systematically harassing and intimidating women who worked for him." "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah asked. "Because I want you to know that not everyone in Marcus's family supports what he did. And because I want to help however I can. I know things about Henderson Construction's business practices that might be relevant to your case." This was an unexpected development. Rebecca Henderson had access to her husband's business records, financial information, and private communications that could provide crucial evidence for Sarah's legal case. "I've been married to Marcus for 8 years, Rebecca continued. "I've seen him make deals, handle contracts, manage employees. I know where the bodies are buried, so to speak." Over the next hour, Rebecca revealed a pattern of questionable business practices that went far beyond workplace harassment. Marcus had been padding invoices for city construction projects, paying bribes to building inspectors, and using company funds for personal expenses. His uncle's position as mayor had protected him from scrutiny for years, but that protection was quickly evaporating as the harassment scandal gained momentum. "Why are you willing to share this information?" Sarah asked. "Because I'm tired of being married to a man I don't recognize," Rebecca said. "The Marcus I fell in love with was confident and ambitious, not cruel and abusive. I want to start over with a clean conscience, and that means making sure he faces the full consequences of his actions." As they prepared to leave the diner, Rebecca handed Sarah a flash drive. Financial records, email correspondence, and recorded phone calls. Everything you need to prove that Marcus's problems go way beyond sexual harassment. That night, Sarah reviewed the contents of the flash drive with growing amazement. Rebecca had been thorough in her documentation. There were years of financial records showing Marcus systematically stealing from his company and his clients. Email chains revealed his involvement in bid rigging schemes for city contracts. And, most damaging of all, recorded phone conversations where Marcus bragged about his ability to manipulate local politicians and law enforcement. By Friday morning, Sarah had turned over the financial evidence to the FBI's white-collar crime unit and the IRS. The harassment complaint she had filed with the EEOC was now just one part of a much larger criminal investigation into Marcus Henderson's business empire. The news that federal agents had raided Henderson Construction sent shockwaves through Millbrook. For decades, the Henderson family had been considered local royalty, wealthy, powerful, and untouchable. The idea that Marcus could face federal criminal charges was almost unthinkable to many residents. But Sarah had learned something important about small-town power structures: they were often more fragile than they appeared. Marcus's influence had been built on a foundation of fear, corruption, and family connections. Once that foundation started to crack, the entire structure could collapse very quickly. The most satisfying moment came on Saturday afternoon when Sarah received a call from Janet Morrison at the newspaper. The reporter had been covering the federal investigation all week, and she had just learned some crucial information. "Sarah, I thought you should know, Marcus Henderson was just arrested at his home. Federal charges for mail fraud, tax evasion, and bribery." His bail hearing is set for Monday morning. Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions.
Relief that Marcus was finally facing serious consequences. Vindication that her decision to speak out had been the right one. But also a strange sadness that it had taken so long for his victims to be heard.
There's something else, Janet continued.
The FBI agent I spoke with said that without your harassment complaint, they never would have started looking into Henderson Construction's business practices. Your courage to speak out is what brought down his entire operation.
That evening, Sarah sat in her apartment reflecting on the week's events.
7 days ago, she had been a harassment victim afraid to lose her job. Now she was the whistleblower whose courage had exposed years of corruption and abuse. The transformation felt surreal. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Maria Santos, one of the other women who had spoken out about Marcus's behavior. Thank you for giving us the courage to tell our stories.
You saved us all.
Similar messages had been arriving all week from current and former Henderson Construction employees, other women in the local business community, and even people from other towns who had heard about the case. Sarah was beginning to realize that her confrontation with Marcus had resonated far beyond her own personal situation. But perhaps the most meaningful message came from her younger brother Daniel, who was in his final year at Texas A&M University.
Sis, I always knew you were tough, but what you did this week was incredible. You showed everyone that bullies can't win if good people are willing to fight back. I'm proud to be your brother.
As Sarah prepared for bed that Saturday night, she thought about the conversation that had started this entire chain of events. Marcus had tried to humiliate her in front of her co-workers, assuming that she would accept the abuse like she had dozens of times before.
He had miscalculated badly.
Instead of breaking her spirit, his cruelty had finally pushed her past the breaking point. And, once Sarah Martinez decided to fight back, she discovered that she had weapons Marcus had never even considered: courage, integrity, and the power of truth. The legal battles were far from over. Marcus would undoubtedly hire expensive lawyers and try to minimize the damage to his reputation and freedom. But Sarah knew she had already won the most important victory. She had refused to be silenced, and, in doing so, she had inspired others to speak out as well. For the first time in 8 months, Sarah fell asleep without dreading the next day at work. She was unemployed and facing an uncertain future, but she was also free from the toxic environment that had been slowly poisoning her life.
And, sometimes, freedom was worth any price.
3 months after the Henderson construction scandal broke, Sarah Martinez found herself in a situation she never could have imagined. What had started as a desperate act of self-defense against workplace harassment had transformed her into an unlikely advocate for workers' rights throughout East Texas. The legal proceedings against Marcus Henderson had moved swiftly once federal investigators got involved. The financial evidence Rebecca had provided proved devastating, and Marcus's attempts to claim ignorance were undermined by recorded conversations where he clearly understood the illegal nature of his actions. His lawyers negotiated a plea agreement that would send him to federal prison for 4 years and require him to pay millions in restitution to the government and his victims. But Marcus's downfall was only part of the story. The real transformation had occurred in how the entire community viewed workplace harassment and abuse of power. Sarah's courage in speaking out had inspired dozens of other people to come forward with their own stories of mistreatment by powerful figures in the local business and political establishment. The ripple effects extended far beyond Henderson Construction. Mayor Robert Henderson, Marcus's uncle, was forced to resign when investigators discovered he had been taking bribes in exchange for favorable city contracts. The building inspector who had been overlooking code violations was arrested on federal corruption charges. Even the local bank president faced scrutiny for his involvement in money laundering schemes connected to Marcus's operation.
Sarah watched these developments with a mixture of satisfaction and amazement.
She had simply wanted to stop her own harassment, but she had accidentally triggered the exposure of a corruption network that had operated in Millbrook for decades. The most unexpected consequence was the job offer that came from the Texas Department of Labor. Commissioner Elena Rodriguez had been following the Henderson construction case closely, and she was impressed by Sarah's thorough documentation of workplace violations and her courage in pursuing justice despite significant personal risks. "We need people like you working for the state," Commissioner Rodriguez explained during their phone conversation.
"People who understand what workers face every day and aren't afraid to stand up to powerful interests."
The position was as a workplace rights investigator, traveling throughout East Texas to investigate complaints of harassment, discrimination, and other labor violations. It would mean leaving Millbrook, but it also offered Sarah the chance to help other workers who found themselves in situations similar to what she had experienced. The salary was nearly double what she had earned at Henderson Construction, and the benefits included full healthcare coverage and a state pension. But, beyond the financial security, the job appealed to Sarah's sense of purpose. She could use her experience to help others who might not have the courage or resources to fight back against abuse. Before accepting the position, Sarah wanted to tie up loose ends in Millbrook. The civil lawsuit against Marcus and Henderson Construction was proceeding through the courts, and her attorney was confident they would win a substantial settlement.
But, more importantly, Sarah wanted to make sure that the changes in her hometown would be lasting.
She had been working with Janet Morrison and other local activists to establish a workers' rights organization that could provide support and resources for people facing harassment or discrimination. They called it the East Texas Workers Alliance, and it was already helping people in situations similar to what Sarah had experienced. The organization's first major success came when they helped a group of hotel housekeepers file complaints against their supervisor for sexual harassment. The case was resolved quickly when the hotel's corporate office learned about the documented abuse and fired the supervisor. The housekeepers kept their jobs and received financial compensation for the mistreatment they had endured.
"You started something here," Janet told Sarah during one of their planning meetings. "People aren't afraid to speak up anymore. They know they have support."
The transformation was visible throughout Millbrook. Businesses were updating their harassment policies and providing better training for managers.
The city council had passed new ordinances requiring transparency in government contracts.
And, most importantly, workers throughout the region were beginning to understand that they had rights and resources to protect themselves. But, the most personal validation for Sarah came from an unexpected source. Rebecca Henderson had used her divorce settlement and knowledge of her ex-husband's business practices to start a consulting company that helped small businesses implement ethical workplace policies. She asked Sarah to be her first partner in the venture. "I want to spend the rest of my career making sure no woman goes through what you experienced," Rebecca explained. "I profited from Marcus's corruption for years without understanding the cost. Now I want to use that money to fix the damage he caused." Their consulting firm, Workplace Solutions Texas, quickly gained clients throughout the region. Many businesses were eager to demonstrate their commitment to ethical practices in the wake of the Henderson construction scandal. Sarah found that her reputation as someone who had successfully challenged a powerful abuser made her an effective advocate for policy changes. The consulting work also allowed Sarah to stay connected to Millbrook while taking the state job. She could investigate workplace violations during the week and help businesses implement better policies on weekends. It was exhausting but deeply satisfying work. 6 months after the confrontation that started everything, Sarah received an invitation that surprised her. The Millbrook Chamber of Commerce wanted to give her their annual Citizen of the Year award for her contribution to improving workplace conditions throughout the region.
The irony wasn't lost on her.
Just months earlier, she had been a receptionist afraid to lose her job. Now the same business community that had tolerated Marcus Henderson's behavior for years was celebrating her for exposing it. The award ceremony was held at the Millbrook Community Center, and Sarah was amazed by the turnout. Her father sat in the front row, beaming with pride. Her brother Daniel had driven down from college for the event.
Co-workers from Henderson Construction, other harassment victims, and dozens of community members filled the auditorium.
When Sarah accepted the award, she thought about what she wanted to say to represent not just her own experience, but the experiences of all the people who had found the courage to speak out. 6 months ago, I was just trying to do my job and support my family, Sarah began.
I never intended to become an activist or a symbol of anything. I just reached a point where I couldn't stay silent about abuse anymore.
She paused and looked out at the audience, seeing faces of people whose lives had been changed by the events that started with her confrontation with Marcus. but what I learned is that silence protects abusers, not victims.
When we stay quiet about mistreatment, we give bullies permission to continue their behavior.
When we speak out, we discover that we're not alone, and that our voices together are powerful enough to create real change. Sarah talked about the importance of documenting abuse, knowing your rights, and supporting other victims. She emphasized that change was possible, but it required courage from ordinary people who were willing to stand up to extraordinary power. Marcus Henderson thought his money and connections made him untouchable, Sarah said.
He was wrong.
No one is above the law, and no one has the right to abuse their power over other people. But it's up to us to hold them accountable. The standing ovation lasted for several minutes, and Sarah was surprised to find tears in her eyes. The young woman who had been afraid to lose her receptionist job had become someone who could inspire others to fight for their dignity and rights. After the ceremony, Maria Santos and Jennifer Walsh approached Sarah with news that brought the story full circle. "We wanted you to know," Maria said, "that we're starting a support group for workplace harassment survivors. We want to make sure other people have the resources we didn't have when we were going through our situations." Jennifer added, "And we're working with the state legislature on a bill that would strengthen protections for whistleblowers and harassment victims.
We want to make sure what happened to us never happens to anyone else." This was exactly what Sarah had hoped for.
Her confrontation with Marcus had been personal, but the changes it inspired were systemic and lasting. The culture of silence and intimidation that had protected abusers for decades was being replaced by a culture of accountability and support for victims. As Sarah drove home that evening, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed. She had a job she loved, work that mattered, and the respect of her community. But, most importantly, she had learned that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they refused to accept injustice. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Ms. Martinez, my name is Amanda Chen, and I work for a tech company in Austin. I heard your speech tonight on social media, and I wanted you to know that it gave me the courage to file a harassment complaint against my supervisor.
Thank you for showing us that we don't have to suffer in silence." Sarah smiled as she read the message.
This was why she had fought back against Marcus Henderson. Not just for herself, but for Amanda Chen and thousands of other workers who deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. The final confrontation with Marcus had come during his sentencing hearing 2 weeks earlier. Sarah had been given the opportunity to make a victim impact statement, and she had used the time to address not just the harm he had caused her, but the broader impact of his abuse of power. Marcus sat at the defendant's table looking nothing like the arrogant bully who had terrorized his employees. Federal prison was waiting for him, his business was bankrupt, his wife had divorced him, and his reputation was permanently destroyed. He looked older, smaller, and completely defeated. When Sarah spoke, she didn't express anger or hatred toward Marcus. Instead, she talked about the importance of using power responsibly and treating all people with basic human dignity. "Mr. Henderson used his position to make people feel small and powerless," Sarah told the judge. "He created an environment where harassment was normalized and victims were silenced. The damage he caused extends far beyond the individuals he directly abused. He undermined trust in our institutions and our belief that hard work and integrity matter more than wealth and connections." She concluded by expressing hope that Marcus would use his time in prison to reflect on his actions and possibly find a way to make amends for the harm he had caused. As Sarah finished her statement and returned to her seat, Marcus turned to look at her. For just a moment, their eyes met across the courtroom. Sarah saw something in his expression that might have been remorse, or recognition, or simply the acceptance of consequences long overdue. The judge sentenced Marcus to 4 years in federal prison and ordered him to pay $3.2 million in restitution. Justice had been served, but Sarah knew that the real victory wasn't Marcus's punishment, it was the empowerment of his victims and the changes that would prevent future abuse. Now, as she pulled into her driveway after the Chamber of Commerce ceremony, Sarah thought about the future. The state job would start next month, taking her to communities throughout Texas where workers needed advocates and allies.
Rebecca's consulting business was growing rapidly, with requests for workplace policy reviews coming from companies across the state.
Most importantly, the network of survivors and advocates they had built in Millbrook was expanding throughout East Texas. People who had once suffered in silence now had resources, support, and the knowledge that their voices mattered.
Sarah's phone rang as she unlocked her front door. The caller ID showed her brother Daniel's name.
"Sarah, I just saw the video of your speech tonight," Daniel said. "I wanted to call and tell you how proud I am of you.
When we were kids, you always protected me from bullies. Now you're protecting people you've never even met. You're my hero."
As Sarah settled into her favorite chair with a cup of tea, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. It had started with a simple decision to stop accepting unacceptable treatment. It had continued with the courage to speak truth to power, even when the personal cost seemed too high to bear. But the real transformation had been internal. Sarah had discovered that she was stronger, braver, and more resourceful than she had ever imagined. She had learned that standing up for herself was not just a personal choice, but a responsibility to everyone who came after her. The young woman who had trembled with anger in Henderson Construction's breakroom had become someone who could face down federal judges, challenge powerful institutions, and inspire others to find their own courage. She had proven that Marcus Henderson was wrong about her, wrong about power, and wrong about what really matters in life. Sarah Martinez had tried to humiliate Marcus Henderson by exposing his behavior. Instead, she had humiliated him by showing the world who he really was beneath the expensive suits and inherited wealth. She had left him cold on the floor of his own arrogance, and, in doing so, she had discovered her own true strength. The fight was far from over. There would always be bullies who needed to be challenged and victims who needed support. But Sarah now knew that change was possible, justice could be achieved, and ordinary people possessed extraordinary power when they refused to stay silent. As she turned off the lights and headed to bed, Sarah smiled at the irony of how her story had ended. Marcus Henderson had tried to destroy her career to protect his own reputation. Instead, he had launched her into a career dedicated to protecting others from people exactly like him.
Sometimes the best revenge was simply refusing to be defeated.